It's Martin Field speaking. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you this morning very briefly. I'm going to talk to a few slides and my colleague Trish is going to talk to a few slides. And then we're quite happy to field questions, try and respond as promptly, as positively as we can immediately afterwards. So if we have the next slide. Just to explain who we are as East Midlands Community Led Housing. As the slide says, we're an independent, not-for-profit organisation set up 10 years ago across the East Midlands. By East Midlands, I'm talking about Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Leicestershire, Old Northamptonshire and Rutland. So those 6 county areas. We're governed by a board of independent directors set up as a community interest company, which is a company limited with registered at Companies House. In the 10 years that we've been existing, we've undertaken all kinds of partnerships with a variety of different bodies and external partners. They might be local authorities, parish councillors, landowners, housing developers and associations, but principally with community groups, working with community initiatives to see what people are looking for locally as local solutions to recognise local needs and the best sort of models and ways to implement that, whether it's for new build housing or for managing existing property. We generate fee income from those projects. We do that through helping to set up projects, helping them legally incorporate, building up their skills and capacities, undertaking site and feasibility study assessments and project management. So it's a range of organisations. We have received grants in the last couple of years, but principally we need to raise money from free income along the way. Next slide, please. When we talk about community-led housing, there's a very straightforward, I hope you can see, definition that was agreed by central government a few years ago, and you'll see it at the back of a series of different central policy initiatives in the last few years. It's a broad term that can incorporate a variety of forms and activities from local schemes whose common principle is that the local community is integrally involved in directing a process about what gets decided for whom, how and when. So it's the communities that are in control. Even if they don't own properties at the end of the day, nevertheless, it's the communities that are shaping the scope of the initiative to bring new housing solutions forward with appropriate partners. Next slide. And because of that, people in the community-led housing sector use a variety of approaches to new and existing properties for a variety of outcomes. And what you see here on the left-hand side is a summary of different what you could call models for community-led outcomes, principally using those to arrive at one or other particular kind of outcome. So self-build housing is principally about households collectively or individually commissioning new dwellings, often from other housing providers. It might be kit homes, for example. There's a lot of individual self-builders that order kit homes, but it's people commissioning new dwellings for their own households. Community land trusts are community-based organisations set up in the last few years to be a deliberate mechanism for creating housing that has a long-term community benefit and retains ownership, what's called an asset lock of those properties for long-term benefit, and can have more purchase on managing the rent and the conditions under which properties are let or possibly sold. They sprung out of the Development Trust Association that has an even longer UK history. Development trusts still exist, and you often find those as what's called community bodies that have a wider remit than just housing provision, often working with other employment and training and work initiatives, often having other kinds of assets to do with local properties and local businesses, again focused on community benefit. Cooperative housing has a very, very long democratic history of residents controlling the housing that they're in collectively, usually for rent in this country. Co-housing neighbourhoods are an extension of that, in a sense that Collectively, the residents are going to be in charge of creating a whole neighbourhood environment where there are self-contained dwellings plus other neighbourhood facilities, particularly facilities that will allow people to maximise other opportunities for social engagement and building up local relationships, and facilities to do with, for example, having some shared dining catering arrangements that complement the self-contained kitchen facilities in individual homes, but can do things collectively as a community whole. There are also tenant management bodies that have focused over the years on the management of existing stock, but on improving local services. So again, they're more in line with local aspirations. Next slide, please. How that sector, how the community-led sector differs from the mainstream sector is very principally the bottom-up nature of creating local solutions for local communities, solutions both for housing and neighbourhood facilities that are going to be for local community benefit. What you find is the projects that have been so successful in the recent years, one opportunity they have to be successful is a reduction in basic costs, because they aren't driven by maximising profit in the way that the commercially driven sector, or in particular the private sector, is driven. And when you talk about commercial sector norms for a 15 to 20% profit ratio, after all the other costs for creating properties have been included, that's a sizable potential reduction for schemes that are looking at simply producing the properties without needing to maximise profit relentlessly. That provides also flexibility of control over the types and the amounts of properties that could be designed and created, and, as Trish will move on to, who could be the subsequent occupants. And across the community-led sector, from those different models to do with co-ops and community land trusts and co-housing groups, there is a substantial track record now, new development being accepted in rural places by local and parish councils. Next slide. I'm just going to finish my two slides on an example from our region, and an example that we were a member of a partnership a few years ago in the Peak District in Yulgrave. And here, those properties you see in the picture there are 8 properties that were built by a new organisation that we helped establish, the Yulgrave Community Land Trust, subsequently supported by the Rural Housing Association in the area, which is the Peak District RHA, and Derbyshire Dales District Council, and also in the background, the Peak District National Parks Authority. This created 6 homes for rent and 2 for low-cost shared ownership. Next slide. What we did in helping that project come together was to liaise with local community members and the local authorities, establish the Community Land Trust, help them become legally incorporated, some of the front end of public meetings and public training sessions to build up the CLT's skills, to liaise with the local authority planning and with subsequent funders, to, at some extent, help overcome some initial reticence about this scheme. It was in the centre of the village, on a site that had been gifted to the village back in Victorian times. There was a degree of feeling about it being ashamed to actually build on it. But subsequently, people could see the worth in being able to create a different kind of housing opportunity that was going to have more control by local people and more management in who would be able to subsequently be housed there, and local people using it. That was overcome to the extent, I have to say, that the village is now embarking on the next stage on another site because it's been so successful. And our engagement carried on liaising with the local housing associations and oversight of the overall project development. So I think Trish is going to make a couple of slides now.
So what I'm going to look at a little bit is how community-led housing could assist country estates and land holdings. The first point really is that community-led projects can still use exception site policies, much as registered providers can and other organisations. This is something really touching on what Avril had said. Community-led housing can also give more control over new dwellings. So if dwellings are built on land, you can have local lettings arrangements so that the properties can you can have arrangements so properties can go to people within the local community or within the estate. So you've got some control who's actually going to be living in those properties. Or it might allow the opportunity for low-cost sale arrangements, kind of shared ownership type arrangements where people can buy their properties, but the properties are still retained within the estate and with the land. It allows the provision of properties to help people to manage household need within the area. Again, this is touched on by Avril. You may have, larger families within the area who simply can't afford to move into anything within the area and otherwise would need to move out of the estate and out to the community. And by building, for example, smaller properties, it would allow people within big houses who are under occupied to downsize, and then for everybody then to remain within the area. It provides a mechanism to retain local ownership of land. Community land trusts, at the moment, there is no right to buy for community land trusts. So that's one way of making sure that properties that are built within the land can avoid the right to buy. Although it's worth bearing in mind that only properties that receive public subsidy are eligible for the right to buy. So that's something just to be aware of. And once community-led housing has been set up, it also provides viable models to use with other new community engagements. So further housing initiatives or opportunities on land, or even further community engagements. You see community land trusts that might manage pubs, might manage other village and other community assets, and it just gives a way for that to progress. Next slide, please. Okay, so just some of the suggested next steps that people might want to consider. The first is really to identify sites on estates which have the scale and the potential for supporting new housing projects. So looking at what land is there that might be suitable for housing. And then on the flip side, to look at what kind of outstanding the need is within the area. What housing are people looking for? What is it that they're aspiring to live in? And then to do an assessment then of what land is there and match that with what the demand is. And then you can look at how to try and achieve that and how that can be taken forward. You could arrange with ourselves then to come to talk and present information, much like we're doing today, but tailored really to potentially local groups, parish councils, estate partners, anybody really who you feel would benefit from understanding a little bit more about community-led housing and what it can offer. And then perhaps consider some sort of strategic discussions then with local authorities, housing and planning sections, enabling officers, because, Avril's already talked on some of the issues that there are then dealing with planning. It is quite a minefield. And I think early discussion with housing and planning can help to try and address some of those issues. And again, that's something we're quite familiar with. So that's something we have an understanding of, that strategic placement of community-led housing. And help really with assisting that to make it a reality. Excuse me. Next slide, please. This is our contact details at the back. You've got my details and Martin's. There's links to our website. Our website is being updated at the moment, so if you do look, you may see that change over the next weeks and months. And there's also an introductory video that we produced recently that's available there on YouTube, and it really just provides a bit more information about community-led housing in general, what we can do, and examples of some of the things that we've been involved with. One project that we did, a kind of case study, and then another one which is one was actually new development, one was a refurbishment of properties actually within an inner city, but equally could apply to a rural area. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. So we will now go into a bit of a Q&A. I will stop the screen share. And one observation that I've sort of made, it looks as though one of the beauties of this is that there isn't just a single method of delivery. You can deliver it in many, many different ways that will suit the landowner, the community. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all type of scenario. Would that be fair?
It would be very fair.
Definitely, yeah.
And I suppose the ultimate question is, where does when you're doing houses for private rent, where does the rent go?
Where does the rent go?
Yeah, who's the rent payable to? Or are there almost as many ways to skin that cat as there are examples out there?
The arrangement for dealing with properties once built are going to be in line with the tenure of them, if they're going to be rented or if there's going to be a sale ownership, and who's going to be managing those. So an example of a community land trust that might use the services of an existing housing body like a housing association, that the community land trust could well be the freeholder of the site, but has secured through partnership with a housing association or possibly a housing developer the means to actually build the properties, and then maybe engaging that other body to manage the properties on their behalf and receive an element of the receipt back as possibly as a ground rent over a course of years. In instances where community-led organisations are their own landlords, they're simply managing the rental stream themselves. And so they receive that and allocate it appropriately for the costs of running the properties and repairing at different times over the years, whether it's day-to-day repairs or major repairs over time. So there's a variety of different ways that incoming monies are dealt with, depending on the model and the tenure and the partnership that's involved, to be honest.
Wonderful, thank you. A question here, it says outstanding need is nationally well recognised as well as being government policy. Surely there is generic information available that is common to all applications. Does the CLA have any information available on this? Avril, one for you, or potentially for either Martin or Trish as well, when it comes to outstanding need and you know, just generically available information that you can utilise?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are government targets and government policy which sets out how many houses need to be delivered over so many years or a year for the next 10 years to close the rural housing, the housing crisis more generally. What we find is that these are normally done on a local authority level using things like housing waiting lists. So it relies on somebody identifying that they don't have a house and putting themselves forward for one. And then when they're done on a local authority level, the need is allocated to normally larger settlements or towns and cities, which are deemed to be sustainable and can take some more development. So what this means is that the smaller rural settlements, generally quite small, number one, they might not have put themselves forward as needing a home. So that could include people that perhaps should downsize, or people that perhaps still live with mum and dad and want to move out, but they're quite happy they have a home, so they don't register for one. Or it doesn't take account of people that have already been displaced. So they may have grown up in that community, but now they're further away, so they're not counted in that the original local authorities housing figures, because they may be found and they've already been given a house somewhere else or found a house somewhere else. So while we know the sort of wider government targets, that's, we think, just a drop in the ocean of what the actual need actually is. So that's one of our recommendations in our Sustainable Communities report, is that housing needs to be assessed on a much more local basis, whether that's by parish or perhaps a little bit wider, a couple of parishes, then it'd be much more accurate. And when landowners or community groups or whoever is trying to deliver new housing, they would have a much more reliable need to rely on when going to the planners, and the planners would understand that as well. So we have some, but we don't have enough. That's sort of the short answer.
Thank you.
I mean, I'd perhaps just to comment on that, I'd agree with that, you know, wholeheartedly. I think it's really important to obviously have the community involved in assessing what the need is for a community. My background was originally in local authority, so I've dealt from a local authority point of view with villages where there's been rural housing development, and you'd find there quite typically that if there is no affordable housing there, people don't put their names forward for that. They don't tell anybody because there's nowhere to tell. There's no point putting your name down on a council housing register for properties that don't exist. And likewise, as you said, people who move out of the area, again, wouldn't necessarily, you know, have their name down anywhere because they've already been displaced. And I think having the community involved in assessing at a really local level what the need is within their area, and to be able to go out and to talk to people and say, you know, have you got family that have moved out? Would they like to be living in this community? If there was something affordable there to rent or to buy, is, you know, really key, because then from a planning point of view, you've got really detailed information about your community, because it's really useful to have background on what's happening nationally. But what's really important for that particular site and that land is what's happening in their area. You know, who wants to live there? What kind of rents or property prices could they afford? And what kind of properties need to be there? What size of properties? You know, is it bungalows? Is it 2-bedroomed houses? Is it 3-bedroomed houses? But that really detailed level of information, that again is going to be vital to trying to you know, support any kind of planning application.
Thank you. Another question: given that planning is ultimately there to prevent harm, that is ultimately what is there to protect against harm against the environment, harm against those who are already in that community. Where you have a system of community-led housing where a community itself has brought forward a planning or is bringing forward a scheme, I'm assuming that is A, looked on far more favourably by the planners, and B, does it almost give you the ability to circumvent some planning regulations more generally?
No, I wouldn't conform to an idea about being able to circumvent planning regulations as such. But it certainly is the case that community-driven schemes with clear community support enable schemes to work on a very personal level inside the decision-making structures. You know, schemes for new housing are going to need formal permissions. So there's formal decision makers making formal decisions, and having a human face on that, especially where the proposals involve long-term community link-ups, long-term community benefits, and not simply yet more speculative housing, which at times admittedly does have a bad reputation. When it has that different quality to it, it will have the possibility of a very positive response. More than usual. That's all, you know. I mean, I can't speak for planners who aren't in the room, as it were, but it matters. It really does matter. I suppose I would say schemes that are led by communities start from a strong position of being able to providing they're in conformity with local planning policies, whether they're very, very specific or generic for the whole district area. They have a starting point that's likely to be more promising than simply something speculative that's clearly driven by outside interest.
Wonderful, thank you. Question here. If an estate wants to deliver affordable housing but wants to sort of retain maximum ownership management of the housing once it's built, is there a way that the estate owner working with a community housing arrangement to achieve that? They would have to work within the co-op agreed rules of community engagement, but if they bring forward land that is I can't read it, invitable, then there are subsequently written out of the process. So effectively, is there a mechanism by which estates can still maximise their control or their ownership within a trust once it's built out?
Do you want me to answer that, Trish?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I think because land is going to be in the starting position being held by the estate, then if the estate considers itself to be a really sympathetic and flexible landowner and wants the same from a community-led organisation as a partner, then I think between them there's perfectly all the opportunity to come up with a flexible land use arrangement that retains the ownership principally by the landowner, but is able to demonstrate how, with that landowner's support, the other outcomes can be achieved that still maximise long-term community benefit.
I think it can still be done, can't it, with in terms of kind of local lettings arrangements, sort of a way to ensure that the properties are going to the people for whom the development's been created, sort of people within the local communities and on the local estates. You can have those agreements in place to make sure that happens.
Yeah, it's a combination of agreements to do with the use of the land and a combination of that with agreements to do with the use of the outcomes. So the land ownership doesn't need to be given up, but there's clear mechanisms within an agreement that demonstrates it's coming forward for particular ends and what those ends are in terms of community housing outcomes and how the community is involved in managing the housing at some level or the other when built.
That makes sense. Perfect. Thank you. There is a question about pre-apps advice, but I think we're straying into the grounds of planning here. And I would recommend the person who's asked that question speak to Fenella Collins, who is our head of planning at the CLA, around your particular concerns about that one. But I would certainly say worth having that conversation with Fenella. Another question from me. Can you use community-led housing trusts for the provision of self-build plots?
Yes.
Excellent.
The examples that are used within the community-led sector recently are some self-build schemes down in Cornwall. And Cornwall's a unitary authority now, and there's a similar body to us that exists across the unitary area. Supports a lot of community land trust development over the last few years. And there's 2 or 3 schemes, to the best of my knowledge, that have been self-build plots or involving some self-build plots within a wider range of housing tenures on the wider site. It can certainly be done. And we like the idea of community-led self-build in terms of it being a way of incorporating initiative from local people with determination to create the homes for them to stay in a local area, with the mechanisms that can still see that being available for others to use when that household at some time may choose to move on.
Well, thank you. So I suppose my final question, those people out there who have estates, farms, land that they may wish to sort of bring forward, and also those who have maybe clients out there whose land they manage on their behalf and that they know may well be interested in this. What would be the next steps if they wish to take that forward?
Please contact us. Please contact us. We can come and talk to you in person. We can arrange a similar meeting like this. We can lay out, depending on the particulars of your locality or the land that you may be thinking of identifying, we would be bound to, I have to say, to give you a range of ideas about that. It may be a community or a parish council or a local authority that we're familiar with in other works and can pass on some information about sort of potential formal responses to do with new community ideas. And we could probably bring immediately information from some of our local authority contacts in terms of how people would respond to an estate-based proposal. So we'd be more than happy to be contacted and more than happy to set up a next meeting to explore ideas.
We've provided, as St Martin's gone through one case study, but there would be umpteen different case studies as well that you could provide. So just to give, I think sometimes having a picture, I was like a picture of what people developed can be quite inspirational. So again, to give ideas about what could actually be achieved, what it would look like, what it would look like on the land. So I always think they can be quite helpful. And we would have lots of examples, both within our area, but also from other parts of the country where developments have taken place.
Yeah. There's a very vibrant network of organisations like us that share information and pool information and experience and case studies on a whole range of different things. And it's always interesting to hear of other initiatives that feel like they can be replicated in the East Midlands. Just needs the people to come forward.
Wonderful, thank you. We will circulate your details around to everybody who has attended today, if that is all right, so they can make contact with you directly. So we will stop there, but if anybody does have any further questions, you are very welcome to contact either the CLA or East Midlands Community Led Housing directly to discuss in more detail. So it just leaves me to say thank you, Trish, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Avril, for your presentations today. Very much appreciated. And yes, like I said, we'll be sending out more details to those that have attended today. So thank you for your attendance. Thank you to the presenters. And I hope you have a wonderful day. It's gloriously sunny outside here, and I hope it is with you as well. So thank you all very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.